My mother's laugh cracked across the ballroom like a whip, sharp, delighted, cruel. She turned to the crowd of 400 decorated guests, wrapped her hand around my brother's arm, and said the words she'd been saving for this exact moment. Her? My son is the real soldier. He's the one who deserves to stand here. Nathan stepped forward before I could even react, his palm cutting through the air and landing across my cheek with a crack that silenced the entire hall. "You don't belong here," he snarled. 200 pairs of eyes locked onto us. My skin burned, my vision blurred at the edges. But I didn't move. I didn't raise my hand. I didn't blink. And then the sound came. Chairs, hundreds of them, scraping back across marble floor at the exact same second, like a single organism rising to its feet. 400 officers and veterans stood in unison, their faces hard, their eyes locked on my brother like he was a threat that needed to be neutralized. A colonel stepped into the aisle, his voice cutting through the silence like a blade. "Detain that man. He just struck a 2-star admiral." I grew up in a house where love was a transaction, and I never had anything worth trading. My mother, Carol, ran our family like a business with 2 profitable assets and 1 liability. Nathan was the golden asset, the one she paraded at church functions and bragged about at the salon. My sister Denise was the quiet, obedient asset, always agreeing, always smiling on cue. And then there was me, Maya, the liability. My father had been a Marine, wounded overseas long before I was born, and he lived the rest of his life with a bad hip and a bad set of lungs, coughing through dinners while my mother rolled her eyes like his service was an embarrassing stain she couldn't scrub out. She called it his failed career. She called his medals junk drawer trophies. She never once let him forget that in her eyes, sacrifice was for suckers. The night I told them I was enlisting, my mother's face twisted into something I'd never seen before. Absolute disgust. "You want to end up like him?" she said, jerking her chin toward my father, who sat frozen in his recliner. "Coughing up blood for a government pension? You're not my daughter if you do this." I told her I was doing it anyway. She didn't argue. She went straight to my room, ripped my clothes off their hangers, and stuffed them into a black trash bag. Nathan leaned in the doorway, arms crossed. I didn't cry for long. Grief burns fast when you don't have the luxury of nursing it. Within a month, I was working overnight shifts at a laundromat, sleeping in a rented room above a hardware store, and walking 3 miles to a recruiting station because I refused to become the nothing my mother swore I was. Basic training tried to break me the way it breaks everyone, but I had an advantage nobody else had. I had her voice in my head, cold and mocking, and every time my legs gave out, I heard it again. "You are nothing." And I used it like fuel, pushing through runs, through failure, through nights where my body begged me to quit. Before I shipped out, I did something my mother never knew about. I set up an automatic transfer from my meager paycheck straight into an account that paid for my father's medication and home care. I knew she'd let his prescriptions lapse the second I was gone, and she did, within weeks, until the payments started arriving from a source she never bothered to trace. She assumed the VA had increased his benefits. She never once thought to ask why. For over 2 decades, I rose through the ranks in silence. I deployed more times than I can count, led operators through missions that will never appear in any file civilians can read, and buried friends under flags that never got handed to anyone in my family, because my family. Along the way, there was a night in a parking lot outside Norfolk that I never told anyone about. An elderly man collapsed near his car, clutching his chest, and I dropped everything and performed CPR until paramedics arrived, cracking his ribs to keep his heart beating. I left before he woke up. My unit patch had fallen from my jacket during the chaos and landed in his hand. I never thought about it again. Years passed. I became the youngest woman ever promoted to Rear Admiral in my branch's history. And somewhere in that time, I stopped waiting for my mother to apologize. I stopped rehearsing the speech I'd give her if she ever called. Instead, I started watching her the way I'd study a target. Her obsession with appearances, her hunger for status, her paralyzing fear of public humiliation. So when an engraved invitation arrived on my desk for the National Veterans Honor Gala, and I saw my father's name listed as a guest of honor under my mother's table, something in me went very still. She was using his record, the same service she'd spent 20 years mocking, to buy herself a seat at Washington's most exclusive event. 22 years of calling his sacrifice garbage, and now she was wearing it like a borrowed gown. I could have shredded the invitation. Instead, I circled the date. The night of the gala, I stood in front of the mirror in my dress whites, 2 silver stars freshly pinned to my shoulders, and I thought about the girl who once dragged a trash bag down a dark street with nowhere to go. She was gone. Something harder had grown in her place. I walked into that ballroom and every uniformed officer in the room straightened at the sight of the stars on my shoulders. I moved toward the leadership table, intending to bypass my family entirely. But my mother could never allow quiet dignity to exist in the same room as her performance. She stood, blocked my path, laughed that same cruel laugh, and told the room her son was the real soldier. Nathan struck me in front of 400 witnesses, and that is the exact moment the room detonated behind me, chairs scraping back in unison as 400 operators rose to answer for what had just happened to their commanding officer. The colonel's voice rang out, "Detain that man. He just struck a 2-star admiral." My mother's face went the color of old paper. Before the silence could settle, an elderly man rose from the front table. I recognized him instantly. The stranger from the parking lot, older now, his hand pressed to the chest I had once pounded back to life. He held up a small, worn coin between his fingers, the same patch that had fallen into his hand 11 years earlier. 11 years ago, I collapsed in a parking lot, he said, his voice carrying through the stunned hall. This woman saved my life and vanished before I woke up. I have spent over a decade trying to find her. He turned to my mother, his voice dropping into something lethal and calm. The woman you just called nothing is the reason I am alive today. The hall erupted. Voices called out from every direction, veterans standing to share what I had done for them or their sons over the years, each testimony landing on my mother like a physical blow she could not deflect, could not spin, could not cry her way out of. Her mask, the one she had spent a lifetime constructing, cracked wide open in front of the exact crowd she had spent her life trying to impress. My siblings didn't stay to defend her. Denise disappeared into the crowd within seconds. Nathan was already restrained against a pillar by security, his arrogance finally meeting a consequence it couldn't buy its way out of. I didn't say a word to my mother. I didn't need to. My silence did more damage than any accusation could have. I walked past her, straight to the far end of the table where my father sat, thin and trembling, tears running freely down his face for the first time in over 20 years. "Dad," I whispered, kneeling in front of him. "I'm taking you home." He nodded, his whole body shaking with a sob that had been buried since the night I was thrown out of his house. I helped him to his feet, and as we walked toward the exit, 400 soldiers parted to form a corridor of silent respect, their eyes forward, their backs straight. And then the entire hall rose to its feet in a standing ovation that shook something loose behind my ribs I had kept locked away for over 2 decades. I left my mother standing alone in the wreckage of the life she'd built on other people's backs, surrounded by broken glass and a room full of people who would never look at her the same way again. The truth is, some people will never apologize, no matter how much damage they've done. And waiting for that apology will only keep you standing in the wreckage with them. The only real revenge is choosing to build a life so undeniable that the people who tried to erase you are finally forced to see you clearly. If this story moved you, hit the like button, tell me in the comments who in your life underestimated you, and subscribe for more stories like this one.